Good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Berry. I'm the president of Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park. It's my pleasure to welcome you and to briefly mention that Schoodic Institute is a nonprofit that is a close partner to the National Park Service, dedicated to advancing ecosystem science and learning for all ages. And I'm pleased that we have actually a rather wide range of ages, even here this evening. And my role tonight is a really quick intro because I'm going to ask Abe Miller-Rushing, who is Acadia National Park's science coordinator and a very close coordinator with us as well, to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Mark. Hey, thank you. So I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker, Rick Bonney, who he and I think, have known each other for about 10 years. And he's had a huge influence over my career. You'll see a fair bit of why tonight. Actually, it's kind of funny, we were looking at the slides, and some of the slides we couldn't even, we both give a lot of these slides. We've gone back and forth between a lot of our talks over the years, so our work has been pretty intertwined. I've really appreciated a lot of what Rick has done. I just want to give you a little bit of his background. He's been at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology since, I thought, in 1983, but you were there as a student before that. But he's been on the faculty since 1983. Over that time, he's had over 100 publications. I looked it up on Google Scholar. There are over 4,000 citations in the field. Actually, 3/4 of those have happened in the past 5 years. I don't know if you know that. So the citizen science field has exploded, and so his influence has been really incredible on the field. And we've worked together over the past 4 years or so to create the Citizen Science Association with a bunch of other people as well. And the Citizen Science Association is actually fiscally sponsored here. The fiscal host is here at Schoodic Institute. And it now has over 4,000 members across the world from over 30 countries. And it's going to be having its first conference in May. And there's actually, for those of you who are interested, there's actually a call for proposals that I think for presentations and whatnot that are due on Monday, if you want to be presenting there. And so Rick has had a huge influence on the development of the field of citizen science, and I think you'll see a fair bit of why tonight. And I look forward to your talk tonight, Rick. Thank you very much for coming. Really appreciate it.
You are so welcome. So this is on, correct? So Beth, you can hear me. All right. How many people here have heard me speak before? All right. I think I know all the people who raised their hand. I'm just trying to think about jokes. How many jokes can I use over again? I am really happy to be here at Acadia. Now, you've probably never gone to a talk where the speaker hasn't started by saying, I'm really happy to be here in Tampa or Albuquerque or wherever, right? Isn't that how they all start? Even in Newark. How could anybody be happy to be in Newark, really? So now I have to justify myself, right? So why I'm happy to be at Acadia. Well, over about the last half hour or so, I've been thinking about all of the slides I wish that I had put in this program tonight, just talking to Abe and Seth Benz and other people I've known for a while. But the main reason that I have done what I've done in my career and for citizen science, it really is because of my parents, because they were the kinds of parents that took us out in the wild, bird watching, put bird feeders up in the backyard, got us excited in nature. And in fact, it was my father who first gave me the idea of being a scientist or a citizen scientist without any training at all. It was 8th grade, and I had to do a science fair project. And you remember those where most people get 2 plants and they water one and they don't want to water the other, and they see what happens and they take that in and they get like a C- because it's been done before. Well, I said to my father, I want to do something different. And he said, well, then go find out something that nobody knows. Go out in the woods behind the house and track the birds or the squirrels or the butterflies or whatever and learn something that nobody knows about the wildlife in this part of New Jersey. See, I'm allowed to make jokes about Newark because I grew up in New Jersey. And so I did that every Saturday morning for a few weeks and tracked the birds and found some nests and made some notes and made a science fair presentation about it. And won first place in the science fair because it was original research. So for me, that was the beginning of understanding that anybody actually can be a scientist just by being inquisitive and thinking about the natural world. So just like Arlo Guthrie, I sometimes have to figure out how to get back to where I was when I was starting. Acadia National Park, right. So I had two sisters, and they were younger than me, and when my parents finally got the last of them out of the house and were all alone, what do you think that they did? They went camping at Acadia National Park. So that's why it's really important to me, because this was the place where they went because they were going to restart their going off and reconnecting with each other after the kids were finally gone. And I had never been here until just about 4 or 5 years ago. All right. I imagine everybody can read this from the back of the room, so I won't read it to you. Okay. I think saving the world is a good idea, and I bet most of the people in this room would agree with me. But in order to do it, there's an awful lot of things that we would have to do. We'd have to probably change our political climate, for one thing. But we would also have to understand climate change and invasive species and emerging diseases and air quality and water quality and natural hazards. We'd need so much information about all these things. We need to collect data, and we need to do it in huge quantities and over wide geographic areas and over long periods of time and all over the world, and we'd need to use standardized methods where everybody was collecting the same kind of data the same way so we could compare the information and actually come up with trends and ideas and population estimates. Now, how in the world could we do that? Actually, it's really not hard at all. We do it through citizen science, in which we have the power of people who care about the environment and natural places going out and collecting the data that we need to document and understand and eventually have the information we need to make wise choices about managing natural resources. Now, is there anybody, how many people here had heard the term citizen science before you came here tonight? I think that's pretty much everybody. You can go around the world and you can talk about citizen science. I remember being in customs in London, and the guy really wanted to know why I was there in London, and I told him, and I had to give him a 5-minute lecture on citizen science to get through customs. That was almost as bad as going to Canada in 1971, but let's not go there. So anyway, there are so many different ways that people think about citizen science, and some people really think, oh, it's kids in the classroom collecting data, or it's people looking at the surface of the moon. Well, actually, it's all those things. Citizen science is members of the public engaging in authentic scientific investigations, and I mean authentic, I mean real. This is stuff we don't know yet. This is not putting the two plants together and watering one and not the other and seeing what happens. This is authentic science. And we could be asking questions about the natural world, or collecting or processing data to understand it, or interpreting those data, or doing all those things. And that would be citizen science. And sometimes it's called a lot of other things. Doesn't really matter, actually. Doesn't really matter what you call it, as long as we have the idea that anybody who is willing to stop and learn some directions and take some time to figure out how to do it can collect information from the natural world that can be used to better understand it. And actually, the concept is not new. If you Google citizen science, you'll find, oh, it's this brand new idea that people without training can actually collect data. Well, it actually goes back to a very long time, to Aristotle and Plato, right? But then as science became professionalized over the years, and as people began to understand that it was something that you could learn about, natural history was still the province of amateurs, people who never really had any training, like Thoreau, who arguably was one of the most important early ecologists. But then, around the turn of the 20th century, we began to get organized with citizen science. We began to get large groups of people going out. It wasn't called citizen science then, but we began to get large groups of people going out and collecting data in systematic ways. Like in 1880, the American Ornithologist Union started doing lighthouse surveys where they asked lighthouse keepers to keep track of the birds that were crashing into their lighthouses because they were attracted by the lights. And we were able to start coming up with some early information about migratory pathways, where birds were going during migration by plotting the dead birds at lighthouses. In 1890, the National Weather Service Cooperative Observer Program began with farmers and ranchers and other people collecting information about weather on their property. And there are still some families, particularly in the Midwest and the West, collecting data, same family, same location for over 100 years. Those kind of information are absolutely critical to understand the changing environment because those data are collected in the same place. A very famous citizen science project was started in 1900, the National Audubon Society Christmas Bird Count, which was not started to collect data. The CBC was started as an alternative to hunting by Frank Chapman of the National Audubon Society that wanted to get people out to just count birds instead of killing them, which was the annual tradition on Christmas up till that point. And today the Christmas bird count is still going on, so this would be like the 117th one coming up this year. And those data have been kept and tracked over the years, and there are a lot of publications now that have come out about changing bird populations using those annual snapshots of where birds are at Christmas time. But in the last few years, as Abe said before, in the last couple of decades, citizen science has just taken off. It's launched. It's gone all over the place. And there are a lot of reasons for that. One of them, surely, is the advent of the internet and the way that most people have easy access to it. So this map right here is showing you North, Central, and South America, and it is showing you the center of a population of a migratory species on January 3rd, on average. I don't remember which buttons are which, but one of those is a black-throated green warbler. One of those is going to be a redstart, American redstart. Each one of those dots is the center of the population of a species. And here is where they go, where that population migrates over the course of the year, down in the lower left. The data is changing. It's showing you that these populations that are wintering in South America are moving through Central America, up into North America, breeding. Look at that, it's July, and some of them are already starting, they've already raised their young, and they're already starting to come back. And they're using different pathways in the fall migration, a lot of them coming over the ocean. It's hard for them to do that in the spring because of the prevailing winds, but in the fall they're able to do that. This map is mesmerizing. You can stare at it and stare at it and stare at it. But what you're looking at here is a migration map that has been put together by scientists at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology using data collected from the first 20 some odd years of a project called eBird. I remember when we named eBird, and I remember when we were thinking of all the different names that we could come up with a national checklist program where people could put birds, what they were seeing and where, online for perpetuity. And we were thinking, what the heck could we call this? And first it was the National Bird Checklist Program. And then it was actually Frank Gill, who was the director of science at the National Audubon Society at the time, that came up with the idea eBird. And we all thought, that is really dumb. But like eBird, how many people here had heard of eBird before coming in the room? Okay, pretty much everybody. And none of you think it's dumb, right? You don't even think about it. It's just eBird. It's funny how names can do that. But eBird now, in the first 20 years, has over 300,000 users who have watched birds for 10 million hours, who've put in 250 million checklists. It's global, so it's actually 99.2% of the world's species. I need to update that slide. And more than 100 peer-reviewed scientific publications have been published based on the data from eBird, which is pretty unbelievable. The data from eBird, for example, are used every 2 years. A report comes out called The State of North America's Birds. It's put out by a consortium of groups, both federal and NGO, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And most of the data in the State of the Birds reports comes from eBird every 2 years. But birds are not the only things that people are out there collecting data about, collecting important data about, and monitoring the environment. There are people out there monitoring pollinators. Abe, you should be keeping track of how many slides of these of yours. That's one of yours, I'm pretty sure. It is kind of funny how we just sort of trade back and forth, but maybe I'll surprise you with one here tonight. And the information from all of the different pollinator projects that are going on are being fed into the national strategy to promote the health of honeybees and other pollinators. Boy, Cornell Lab of Ornithology, we never would have come up with a name like that. We do stuff like eBird. We don't do national strategy. That has got to be a US government publication. It has to be. But it's real, and there are lots of projects feeding into it as all across the United States, different people are working together to try to figure out how to improve the populations of pollinators, which are crashing. But you know, it's not only birds and it's not only bugs, it also can include plants. So the National Phenology Network, where Abe used to work as the assistant director, is the place where that keeps track of changes in phenology, and phenology is just a fancy word for timing of events in nature. So the National Phenology Network keeps track of, through its Nature's Notebook program, when buds are blooming, when flowers are blooming, when leaves are changing, when birds are nesting, all of the events in nature that are really, really important to understand, because when we do understand how they're changing, when we do understand that foliage is emerging earlier and that there are mismatches now in the timing of when birds need the different berries that they eat in the spring, or the insects, because bird nesting is tied to when the insect hatches come out. And if there's a mismatch so that the birds are trying to raise their young and the insects aren't there when they need them to feed to their young, the populations can crash. And so it's really, really important to try to understand changes in phenology, because most of these are occurring because of climate change, to try to mitigate against those problems. For example, in the National Climate Assessment, the US National Climate Assessment. But it's not even things that are living. There's also things that aren't living, like hail and rain and snow. So the community collaborative rain, hail, and snow network is a really, really important network of people who are collecting data on precipitation. And the precipitation data at very, very local scales like this are very important for weather forecasters to use to predict things like floods. Where might there be a sudden flood that might really be devastating, and to try to get out an early warning to try to save lives. And it's not only those things, but we can also monitor air quality. One of my very, very favorite stories of a citizen science project took place in Tonawanda, which is near Rochester, New York, where a group of citizens said, you know, we really feel sick. We do not feel well, and we think it's the air. We think it's the air coming from these manufacturing plants that are nearby. So they got some very inexpensive, low-cost air quality monitoring equipment, and they went out into the community and they monitored the air quality, and they found out that there were some really hazardous chemicals in the air. So they called the EPA, and they said, here are the data that we are collecting, and the EPA was concerned, and they sent in EPA scientists who said, wow, these folks they're collecting accurate data. There are some real problems here, which eventually ended up in changes to the way that the smokestacks are scrubbed and situated in Rochester. So just this small group of people using these very low-cost air quality monitoring systems launched a whole air cleaning campaign in around Rochester. And as a matter of fact, I put this slide in just to show that actually a lot of these data can end up in peer-reviewed scientific publications, even when they're collected by amateurs using this very simplified data collecting techniques. And then finally, what happened there? Finally, I don't know what's going on here. I'm stuck. How do I get unstuck, Abe? Well, that's right, I was supposed to yell help. No, I was supposed to yell chocolate. Does anybody know why that's funny? Come on. Nobody knows the story? It's a song. It goes, I fell into a vat of chocolate. Oh, I fell into a vat of chocolate, lolly-doo-dum day. Come on, somebody. I'm not the oldest person in the room. Smothers Brothers, 1960s. There's this great story about falling into a vat of chocolate, and Tommy and Dickie, and like, how did this happen? Well, I just fell in. No, I mean, were you leaning over the rail? Well, maybe somebody like put something slippery on that rail, and then I fell into the vat. And finally, what did you do? I yelled, fire! Why did you yell fire when you fell into the chocolate? Because nobody would save me if I yelled chocolate. Okay, water quality. So water quality, we've probably been measuring water quality longer than any other kind of citizen science data other than probably birds. And there are many streams and lakes and rivers all across North America that have been designated, for example, special trout fishing streams, because fishermen have gone out and monitored the quality of the water and been able to show that it is so pristine and so clean that it needed to be saved and it needed to stay that way. Now, sometimes when you hear, oh, citizen science is this new thing, what's really happening is that people are hearing about the Zooniverse platform. And they're hearing about all the different citizen science projects that are now possible because of all the remote sensing data that we can get from the Hubble Space Telescope, for example, or the way that we can get pictures of the ocean floor, or that we can use cameras to take pictures of animals coming to water holes in Africa. And what happens is that you get all of these images up on the internet, and then thousands or tens of thousands of people can go into those images and classify them, and they can figure out what animals are coming to this water hole, and when, and where, and how many water holes do we need in this part of Africa to sustain this number of lions, for example. So just getting people's eyeballs on all these pictures, or how to monitor the ocean floor and map it, is another way that another form of citizen science that's very important. That's a whole lot newer. This, I'm sure, is one of Abe's slides. He knows a lot more about this kind of citizen science than I do. But the idea is that you can send people into collections, biodiversity collections all over the world that have not been properly digitized, and that you can get all of the information in those collections, birds, bugs, butterflies, and get them digitized so that they can be used by anywhere from the internet. Okay, so there's all of this citizen science going on right now. Well, what does it mean? What is it actually doing? Can we quantify it? Well, a recent paper that came out in Biological Conservation in 2015 sampled about 400 projects that were focused on biodiversity. And just from those 400 projects, they were able to show that there were over 1 million volunteers who contributed to them. And that if you figured out how much we would have had to pay those volunteers for their data, it would have been $2.5 billion each year. And a lot of those projects are resulting in papers in peer-reviewed publications that are showing up in some very top-level, high-level journals. So it's not just like, you know, the annals of the New Jersey Glacier Hills Conservation Society in a part of New Jersey. It's science. It's nature. It's the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and Bioscience. And not only are these folks contributing data that can be really used for scientific publications, but a lot of them are learning a tremendous amount by being engaged in the process of science. And a lot of the information is going into making decisions about the wise use and the best use of natural resources for conservation. This is probably about the best compendium right now so far of information of showing how citizen science can be used for environmental protection. I'm sure somebody will do a more comprehensive one soon. But right now, if you really want to get a picture of how all these data are being used for conservation, this issue of Issues in Ecology is the best way to go. And this issue began right here in this room in 2013. And I remember standing actually right here and reading some of my notes to the folks in this room. But it took us about 1.5 years, I guess, to put this together. Okay, so hopefully at this point, I've convinced you, if you didn't know already, that citizen science is huge, it's important, it's growing, that it's contributing a lot of different kinds of data, that those data are going for science, they're going for conservation, and people are learning in the process. I want to just spend a couple of minutes talking about the rigor of citizen science, or the potential rigor of citizen science, because even though we have all of these publications coming out, there are still a lot of scientists who are dubious, who say, I don't know, I don't really know if I trust those data. How could people not trained in science actually collect useful information? And so I want to talk to you just for a few minutes about eBird. I am from the Lab of Ornithology. It is our project, so I get to tell you a little bit more about eBird. eBird started for a few different reasons. One of them is because just simply we needed to have a national checklist program where people who were watching birds could get all that information into one centralized database. And I dreamed of eBird for years and years and years, but what actually happened to really make me think it's time to write a proposal to get this funded was actually a site visit that I made to a 5th grade class in Orlando, Florida that was doing our classroom feeder watch project. So they were counting birds that were coming to the feeders in their schoolyard. It's a really cool project, really valuable in a lot of ways. But I was standing out there with the kids and we were watching the feeders, and one of them said, look, there goes a roseate spoonbill. But we can't count it because it's not in the count area. Oh, look over there, I hear a mockingbird. I see it. Oh, but we can't count it because it's not in the count area. And so I thought, we've got to give these kids a way to put all these data into a checklist. So even though it was really, really important to do this for conservation purposes because there's all these birders, it was, for me, writing that first proposal, it was that instant in Orlando, Florida. So the idea is that bird watchers have been keeping lists, yard lists and vacation lists and checklists of birds for so long that they have shoeboxes full of information, but they need to have a place to put it. And so what we did, using the power of the internet, was we came up with a national checklist project, but it's not just like, send us anything you see, send us any bird you see. Those data aren't really going to be useful because we need more information, we need context. We need to know how many people were observing, what time of day was it, where were you exactly? Was this an incidental sighting that you just happened to see a golden eagle out the window of your car and you wanted to tell us it was there, which is fine, that's useful, it will go on a map. Or were you actually doing a point count or a line transect? And can you repeat this day after day? So the first thing that happens when you go into eBird is you put in the date, but you also tell us what kind of a sighting that you've been working on that day. And then what happens is you get a list of birds for that time of year in that location only. So if you look carefully here up at the top, you'll see it says Albuquerque, New Mexico. And that's because I was in Albuquerque and I was bird watching and I made this, I was going to do a checklist. And so I put in the information. This is the checklist that came up for me. It was specific to Albuquerque at that time of year. And later, I was in Berlin, Germany, and I was bird watching and I wanted to put in some data and I did the same thing, but I got a list of the birds that I would see in Berlin on that day. So right off the bat, the eBird checklist is only giving you things that you are likely to be able to see or hear. And a lot of people are now using the app. They're using the eBird app. And of course, because it's coming off of a telephone, it knows where you are. And it knows the time of day and the time of year. So it can really, really give you an accurate list of possible birds right off the bat. And so what happens, you see, is that people will put in the birds that they saw and they'll click on submit. And when they click on submit, the information will go into the eBird database, but if they put in a species that is not likely to be seen where they are at that time of year, like the one on the left, or if they put in a count, like they put in 1,000 American redstarts and they actually really meant to put in 10, but they added a couple of zeros, then a little flag appears. You won't be able to see it, but our regional editors will. And there are almost 2,000 regional editors behind the scenes who are keeping track of these potentially problematic sightings. And when they see a dog bird, they say, and it doesn't get accepted into the records. But you know what? 70–80% of the time when somebody actually reports something, and it hasn't been just a keystroke error, they're saying that they saw a Say's phoebe in New York, for example. Most of the time they're right. Bird watchers are actually really, really good at what they do. Even amateurs, even folks who are, not professional ornithologists are really, sometimes they're better than professional ornithologists. So our regional editors are very, very often discovering, these data actually are really accurate. And then one other thing that happens is when you go to submit, it says, are you reporting all of the birds that you saw or heard to the best of your ability? Please indicate below yes or no. If somebody says yes, that they are reporting all the birds that they saw or heard to the best of their ability, we have an idea that the birds that they didn't report probably weren't there. But if they don't click that, then we don't know. They might have just been ignoring the sparrows, for example. So that is a really, really important little piece of data. And using the information that's coming in from these thousands and thousands of reports, we're able to not only show migration maps like I showed you before, but we're able to go in species by species and actually show their annual occurrence in the United States. And if you want to know why I chose willow flycatcher, you'll have to ask me later. These are also pretty mesmerizing. And so, with this eBird program, gathering rigorous data that's checked by regional editors and then analyzed by professional ornithologists at the Lab of Ornithology, we're able to start producing all kinds of publications like this one, The Implications of Mid-Latitude Climate Extremes for North American Migratory Bird Populations, which begins to tell us something about the impacts of climate change. But because we also make the eBird data available to anybody who requests it, either as a basic data set or a reference data set, then anybody in the world who wants to study the eBird data and write publications from it can do so. This one here, Spatiotemporal Variation in Avian Migration Phenology, Citizen Science Reveals Effects of Climate Change. Again, climate change. But these two researchers here are not Lab of Ornithology researchers. I don't know who they are. I don't think anybody at the lab has any idea who they are. They requested the data, they downloaded it, they wrote their paper, they got it published. It's awesome. The data belong to, they're collected by everybody and they belong to everybody. And also, we're able to make portals using the eBird system so that we're able to create portals for different atlases, like the Louisiana Bird Atlas can do all of their atlasing using the eBird checklist system. We can do this in different countries, Aves in Mexico, by translating it into Spanish. And what we do is we give, like here, we give Canabio, they're the ones who are in charge of this homepage, not the Lab of Ornithology, so that they can really personalize it and customize it to their culture and their language. Australia, I was really interested in this one because we got to go to Australia a couple of summers ago. And the other thing that you can that's really, really fun to do with eBird is you can figure out where to go to see certain birds. So my wife, Judy, who's somewhere in the back row here, and I were here in Canberra when my talk was done. It was the next day, and Black Mountain was right nearby, and we said, what are we going to see if we walk up into the Black Mountain Nature Reserve? And 3 or 4 clicks, and we were able to get a checklist. We were able to look in our field guide and see what the heck these birds were, because we'd never seen them before, and we were ready for them when we got up to Black Mountain. It's really pretty unbelievable. And you can keep your own personal records, your life list, your yard list, your vacation list, your friend's vacation list. You can check your friend's vacation list and make sure you've still seen more than she has. For free, backed up, in triplicate, in perpetuity. And also, we make it possible for you to explore all these data with, by region and by hotspot, to keep track, as I said, about your yard totals and stuff. And because we're able to do that, eBird becomes a very, very powerful educational tool for working with teachers and informal youth leaders. So we've created something called Bird Sleuth, which is a K-12 version of eBird, where the kids are doing their own bird studies in their classroom. We train the teachers to use it. We have a whole bunch of different curriculum resources. We've got lots and lots of different lessons that are possible. And if you were a different audience on a different night, I might be giving you a 1-hour talk about all the different measurements we've done of student learning and what they're learning and how they're learning from this project. And we can take the eBird data and we can use it to do some really, really powerful conservation work. So for example, here, what we're doing is we're looking at part of California, part of Central California, and we're figuring out the migratory pathways of a whole lot of waterfowl, including pintails, and we're figuring out when they need to have flooded fields, exactly what week they need to have flooded fields while they are migrating. And using this information of knowing where the birds are migrating and where the fields need to be flooded instead of farmed, what we're able to do is work with the Nature Conservancy in a reverse auction and pay farmers to flood their fields instead of growing rice. They get more money from flooding the fields than from growing the rice. And then they can drain the fields after the birds are gone and then get their rice crops started. It's been incredibly successful because of the power of thousands of people watching the pintails and sending us the data. So eBird is an example of a very powerful citizen science program. I could have shown you others. Because I'm from the Lab of Ornithology, that's the one I showed you, but I could have been showing you the Reef Environmental Education Foundation's Great Fish Survey if I happened to work for Reef. Or if I happened to work for the National Phenology Network, I might be showing you all kinds of results from Nature's Notebook. But one thing that we still have to do is we have to take all of these different projects, all of these different organizations, all these different ideas together and actually build a field of citizen science. We have to stop just having one project over here and one project over there. We've got to all work together in a very concerted way if we're actually going to save the world. And one of the things that we really, really have to do is maintain high standards and high credibility in the field. Because as soon as we don't, as soon as we start doing junk science with citizen science, then those professional scientists who are saying, how can amateurs collect reliable data, will have a point. We can't let that happen. So I'm just going to finish up here by talking just about some of the things that I think that we still need to do, that we're getting started on doing, some of the real exciting vistas or frontiers for citizen science that are in front of us. One thing is that to build a citizen science project effectively, you really need to follow the steps of building a citizen science project effectively. The first time that we figured out, we had a group of people get together at the Lab of Ornithology in 2007 and come up with these steps for project design like a toolkit. And we published this in Bioscience that year. Since that time, the federal government, which now has its own citizen science community of practice, which I don't really have a whole lot of time to talk about tonight, but these are representatives of different federal agencies like the Park Service who are meeting together to try to figure out how to advance the field. They've created their own website, which in and of itself is amazing, that the federal government put together a whole bunch of different agencies to create a website for citizen science. And they borrowed heavily from our toolkit to do it, and they expanded on it and added some new resources. Last year, Jennifer Shirk, who is the acting director of the Citizen Science Association, which I'll tell you about in a minute, and I put together what I think is the most comprehensive framework or synthesis of how to design a citizen science program that's been done so far. That's kind of the outline of what it looks like. And so if you are interested in knowing more about project design, then going to the website citizenscience.org, you'll be able to find all of these resources. Okay, so really making sure that we have the very best project design is really important for growing the field. But another thing that's really important is enabling and facilitating groups of people who want to do citizen science well, but they're not really sure how yet. Community organizations, community science projects, this is where some of the very most powerful change is going to be made going forward in conservation. So this is a fairly old example at this point. This is from Tillery, North Carolina, and the folks that were involved in this project probably never heard the term citizen science. But just like with the people who were choking on the air in Tonawanda in New York. These folks were choking on the air in North Carolina that was coming from the hog operations in their communities. So they got together with some scientists. I forget which university it was from, but they got together with some scientists that helped them design a protocol to collect the data on their own health. They learned how to collect data on respiration and their breathing and asthma and other things that were going on with their own health. And after a while, they had enough information to convince local authorities that the hog farms were very deleterious to the health of the people living in those areas, which resulted in zoning for the hog farms in that part of North Carolina. Another example, this one doesn't really have to do with health, but there is an ornamental evergreen in the Pacific Northwest called Salal. And a lot of people harvest this and make a living off it, but if it's not done carefully, then what can happen is it can really go locally extinct. So one of our colleagues, Heidi Ballard, who's an associate professor at the University of California, Davis, actually for her PhD thesis, she got together about 25 workers who were harvesting salal, who were not scientists and didn't know anything about science, and she worked with them to create a protocol to monitor when it was growing, where it was growing, how fast it was growing, and to figure out what the sustainable harvest would be, and to stick to it. And so these 25 or so, mostly migrant workers actually, worked together to put this study together to figure out the sustainability system for salal. And some of them were actually offered jobs by the U.S. Forest Service afterwards. We had gotten to know a lot of the Forest Service biologists, and the Forest Service biologists understood that they knew enough to be field technicians just from being part of this project. So tremendous educational opportunity. And what's starting to happen now is that moving out of just like a hog farm in North Carolina or one particular species of salal, there are entire ecosystems, watersheds that are getting together to try to figure out how they can manage their area sustainably through collecting data through citizen science. The thing is that we don't really have enough support out in the world yet for these groups to figure out how that they can actually monitor, what to monitor, when to monitor it, how to set up a protocol. They really need somebody to mentor them through the process of learning to become a scientist. Let's just pretend I didn't put that slide up there right this minute. Public Lab is an example of one organization that has come together to make available low-cost, do-it-yourself techniques, instruments that can be used for measuring water quality and air quality, for example. And then in London, University College London, another colleague of ours, Muki Haklay, has started something called Extreme Citizen Science, or XScience, where he's starting to mentor groups in Africa to get out and do their own citizen science work. These are a group of women from the Congo who are learning to monitor illegal poaching and harvesting, timber harvesting, working through the Extreme Citizen Science program. But we don't have enough of those yet. We really, really need to be raising funding, raising funds to be able to mentor and shepherd and really launch community organizations all over the world to do this kind of work. And then in addition to that, there are whole swaths of data that we're not collecting any information about. This diagram is from a paper by Finn Danielson, who is from Copenhagen. He runs an NGO in Copenhagen that focuses on community monitoring. This was published in Conservation Letters. And what Finn did with a team of people was he looked at 12 international agreements that all had to do with figuring out what different organisms and ecosystems we were trying to conserve all around the world. He looked at those 12 international agreements. Among them, they came up with 186 indicators of environmental health that needed to be monitored. Data needed to be collected. Then he determined that 63% of those indicators can involve citizen science. So in order to get more than half of the information that these 12 international agreements were saying that we need, more than half of that could be done through citizen science programs, and a quarter of them could be done by citizen science only. But right now, we don't have the capacity to figure out exactly what those data are, where they need to be monitored, and who's going to do it. It's just really, really incredible. It's this whole vast, army of people willing to gather the data, but no real organizing body to do it. Well, as one step in that direction, we have formed something called the Citizen Science Association. And this got started formally, I don't know, there's many different ways of deciding when this started. Somewhere between 2010, 2012, but we were finally incorporated in 2015 with the mission of advancing citizen science through communication, coordination, and education. And we now have over 4,000 members from more than 30 countries. And we're doing biennial conferences. So our first one was in San Jose, California in 2012? 2014. It was Portland, Oregon in 2012. 2014 in San Jose, and the next one's going to be in the Twin Cities, St. Paul, Minneapolis in May of 2017. We have a journal, a peer-reviewed journal about citizen science. This is not for the results of citizen science. This isn't where you would publish a map showing eBird data. This is where you publish information about how to develop a project, the theory behind it, the best practices for implementing a project, running it, and evaluating its outcomes. The first issue of this was published in May, and the second one is just starting to come out right now. The one slide I did not have time to stick in here before getting here tonight was I wanted to show the importance of professional development for the field of citizen science. And I have a picture of a bunch of people, again, sitting in this room, being trained about how to effectively do citizen science. And so what we really need to be doing is working with the professionals in the field of citizen science to provide them with the tools and the information they need to develop the very best projects. And we think we can do that through the Citizen Science Association. And in fact, the Schoodic Institute is one of the leading groups that is working toward professional development for citizen science and doing a lot of that work here. As Abe already mentioned, the Schoodic Institute is the fiscal sponsor for the Citizen Science Association. And we thank you guys for that, by the way, while I'm saying that. It's been of tremendous, tremendous importance to us. So the association is a step of bringing together a lot of people to try to organize and build the field of citizen science, but there's so much to be done. It's almost like 20 years ago with eBird, we had this idea of what we could do, and now we've been able to show the importance of getting people to send in their bird data. Now we're starting all over again. Now we can see the importance of having all of these citizen science projects working together, but it's overwhelming. We don't have money. We're short on time. The environment is crashing around us. We've really, really got to figure out at this point how we're going to marshal the resources to really build the field. And for me, the reason that I want to do this is because it always comes back to place. It comes back to saving places that are important to us. And doing that, I think, through data is one really, really important thing that we can do to conserve the environment. This is my power place right here. I put this partly to show you that there are very, very beautiful beaches that don't have rocks on them. This is actually the Cape Cod National Seashore in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, which is part of my family is from Wellfleet. I spent my summers going here and worked here while I was in college. Truly, truly loved the Cape. And I know that this is one of those special places that was conserved, just like Acadia, by people really, really caring about the environment. And so I think I'm ready to stop there and take some questions if I haven't put you all to sleep or worn you all completely out.
Rick, you alluded twice, I think, to the possibility of professional trained scientists having some resistance to citizen science and questioning the quality of the data and that sort of thing. But what about possible, it to hear your thoughts on the possibility or maybe the reality of resistance from lawmakers, other politicians, industries that are mandated or being asked to change practices in response to data collected by non-professionals.
Huh. Okay, did everybody hear that question in the back of the room? Yes. Okay. That's too bad, because I was going to repeat it, was going to give me a minute to think about the answer to that one. Chocolate. Yeah. Okay, and let me talk for just a minute about the professionals, even though your question was not really about the professionals. I think one of the things that's really changed the minds of a lot of professional scientists is simply seeing the success of citizen science over the last couple of decades. More and more papers coming out, less and less questioning about the methodology, more understanding that it can be really rigorous. And I think also understanding that citizen science data can't do everything. The only thing that citizen science data can do well is what citizen science data can do well, which is to collect a lot of information, sort of course level information over long spans of time and over large areas, right? There are other things that you need to have professional scientists do. They really need to dig in and hypothesize, and sometimes the citizen science is best for showing you a pattern or a population in trouble that you can then dig into. And I think even in the last 3 years, the resistance of professionals has changed. There was a meeting this year, IMCC4, International Marine Conservation Congress 4, which happened in Newfoundland. And Jennifer Shirk went to that for a whole bunch of different reasons, but she counted the number of citizen science papers that were given during that IMCC4 meeting, and it was about 30% of the papers. That wasn't because there was a focus on citizen science. It was just that's how much the marine community is now starting to understand the power and potential. And so I think a lot of that resistance is starting to melt away with a better understanding that we're just trying to use the data for the things that those data are good for. But when you ask about politicians and lawmakers and companies, I mean, my one response to that is, well, what the heck are you going to do against lawmakers and politicians and companies anyway? They don't, most of the time, deal with facts. So most of the decisions are made on the basis of emotions anyway. There's so much smoke and there's so much obfuscation. I guess I would need time to really reflect and think about how to answer that question, but maybe here's one thing that I could say. We had a project for a while called Communicating Climate Change. And the idea with that project was that people were collecting local indicators of climate change in their own backyards. And the idea was that when people started to understand, that the data that they were collecting were showing indicators of climate change, and then their neighbors said, but climate change is a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese or whatever, they could say, well, wait a minute, I collected some of those data. I've studied them myself. That's my data you're talking about. So maybe in a way, trying to have the public invested in the project and in the data is a way that will be a little bit of a fight against some of the corporate or the political will there. Does anybody else have Judy, do you have a thought?
Well, one of the things that I think...
This is a ringer in the back row to whom I've been married for 40 years.
One of the things that I think is so powerful about the Towanda example is that the public initiated the studies about the air pollution, and the EPA would not have gotten involved if they hadn't started the study. And then the EPA said, yes, this is something worth investigating, so that you then get maybe what's considered more legitimate organizations involved in saying, yes, this is actually happening. And that may be, more likely to change the minds of politicians.
What do you think?
I don't know. This is totally hypothetical to my knowledge. This hasn't really come up. But I could imagine that a regulated industry or a political action group or any group with a lot of money and lobbyists, I would just expect that in the the near future, they might start to develop arguments to seed doubt about the quality of data, where you end up with high-level politicians in positions of great power basically saying, well, these data were collected by fifth graders. And I know CSA is international, but it may be that, even within national groups, to anticipate that sort of challenge coming from detractors and having, as part of professional development, how do you counter that argument? How can you be proactive in helping restore public and politicians' trust in the value of the science?
So I have two questions that'll reflect.
I'm going to answer that one first.
No, I'm not even going to try. I certainly can speculate along with all sorts of scenarios. Two questions. One, traditional knowledge. Where do you see the intersect between traditional knowledge, which we generally define as coming from, or generally look at coming from, indigenous or long-standing communities? And then secondly, is there anyone working within this sphere who are going backwards, mining the diaries, of which Thomas Jefferson and others are particularly well known of, but for which there exist thousands of diaries where that information can be mined from?
Yeah. Okay, it's been a long day. What was the first thing you said? Traditional knowledge, right? LLTK, right? Lay, local, and traditional knowledge. That's just so important. I remember Chris Clark, who's the director of the Bioacoustics Research Program at the Lab of Ornithology, studies whales, and he's been doing it for a really long time. And when he first went up to the Arctic, they were talking about a species of whales, and the Native Americans said, that's two species of whales. And the scientists all said, no, it's all one species of whale. Well, you know where I'm going with. DNA has now shown conclusively that it's two and maybe even three species of whales, and that the Native Americans knew that all along. And in fact, even though they looked the same, they had some different migration patterns and some different behavioral attributes about them. Some of the community programs that we've found out about over the years have involved, in particular, Native American populations, gathering data about salmon in some cases. I think it's a really, really important kind of knowledge that needs to be looked into, and try to figure out a way of getting it into databases where it can be actually used and studied and validated. I don't really have a whole lot more to say about it than that. I think that the scientists who are working in the Arctic are working much more closely with native knowledge than folks in the United States. And it may be that it's maybe more lost here than it is in the Arctic. I'm not really sure. It's not really my area. That's a lousy answer to your question at the end of a long day. We climbed Sargent Mountain today. Finn Danielson, whom I mentioned, you could learn a lot more about traditional knowledge by going to his website, which is called monitoringmatters.org. He would really help you. Okay, so now help me remember the second half of your question. Oh yeah, well, mining data that are already there, ship's logs, diaries, really, really an important thing to do. Abe is actually kind of an expert in that, because Abe has mined Thoreau's diaries around Walden Pond and gone back and used all those information to figure out what was blooming then. How many years ago was that? 160 years ago. And then to have folks go out and collect information about those same species now and to be able to compare them. So without Thoreau's diaries, all of that information would be lost to us. And a lot of the Zooniverse, the Zooniverse projects, on the Zooniverse platform, a lot of those are about transcribing old diaries and ships, captains' logs, and things like that. Really important to do that. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people willing to sit and do it.
And I've been sitting here thinking about that because, you know, Nate Silver talks a lot about the signal and the noise. There's so much data. There's so much noise out there. But the bottleneck is with people that can take all of that data and do something with it. Do you have any thoughts about creating a community of practice of the professionals who mine citizen science to be able to make meaning from all of that?
That's a really good idea. I would say that within the Citizen Science Association, that's probably not a group that we've had a real lot of representation from. It is very challenging to go into something like the eBird data set and make those maps and figure out, get the signal and the noise separated from each other. I know that there are, the National Science Foundation issues requests for proposals from time to time in the cyber world that are specifically aimed at data mining and big data. It's not an area that I know very much about, but I'm sure we probably need to start a user group, with a working group within the Citizen Science Association to do that. Is there a question in the back?
Well, I was going to ask about, with all the data that needs to be gathered, it would seem that recruitment of citizens is quite important to this whole process. And is there a national program to help organizations recruit the citizens to do this?
A national program to help them recruit? Not yet. So far, it's really been program by program, project by project. You're right, recruitment is essential, and not only is recruitment essential, but retention's even more essential. How do you make sure that people keep collecting data and coming back year after year? There's a lot that needs to be done, treating people with the utmost respect and realizing they're spending a lot of time, energy, and giving you that information, telling them what you're finding with their information. In some cases, having folks be authors on publications when they've contributed a whole lot of data. So that the retention is really, really important. One of our postdocs one time came up with a statement that was so important. She said, it's easy to make citizen science out of a hobby, but it's really, really hard to make a hobby out of science. And what she was saying is if you've got people who are collecting data about butterflies or birds or snow, it's really easy to get them to just take the next step, put it in a database, send it to you, especially if they can get to see their own records. Going out and saying, okay, segmented worms here in the Great Lakes are really in critical trouble, and we really need you to study segmented worms. That's not easy. It's really, really, really hard. But there's so much that we haven't even done yet with the data that people are already collecting. Like, for example, fishermen could be giving us so much more information about the fish that they're catching in trout streams all across the country, and would be willing to do it through organizations like Trout Unlimited. So even really starting there and doing a better job of gathering all the information that's already of interest, I think, to folks is important. Maybe a culture, maybe some of the kids who are doing a lot of these projects in 4th and 5th grade will have a different interest or be interested in doing it when they grow up. That's one of the reasons that we keep on going after teacher and class after class to try to get them into these citizen science projects, whether it's through the Nature's Notebook or Feeder Watch or whatever it is. Yeah. Hang on just a second. Follow up.
We're volunteers for Seth, and we are full-time RVers who represent a large segment of potential citizen scientists. And you know, we talked a little bit about investing in citizen science, and a couple of RV sites here and there goes a long way. It's not very expensive, and you get a captive audience that can come back year after year after year. Now, a whole lot of us aren't going to be monitoring a lot of snowfall, but a little incentive to just come and have a campsite and keep our expenses down goes a long way and can gather a ton of wonderful data. And we volunteered for national parks and national wildlife refuges, and these folks over here are volunteers here at Acadia, and they're on their way to a national wildlife refuge. So, I mean, there's an extreme amount, there's a whole army of RVers out there that are willing to participate in this. So,
Yeah,
just my comment.
that's a great point. I don't think we've tried very hard at all to work with those folks, or even really just to work with AARP, with retired folks that have time and interest. So I'm going to remember that one. Thank you.
Even just a couple of good articles in like RV.
In RV magazine, yeah, great.
So maybe one more question?
Were you trying to just?
In the case of the ocean fisheries management systems, when there's an annual estimate by the Fisheries Management Association of how many fish there are, and therefore what they allowed catch of particular species will be at a given year, there's a very common pattern of the scientists saying, well, there are only so many and we better hold it down to this level. And the fishermen saying, well, we've seen them here and we've seen them there and it should be up at this level. So that would be, I think, an example of where, of course, the politics is always involved in the decision to some degree, but it would be a place where the citizens involved in this type of science would be somewhat suspect, because it's their interest to pump the number up and get a higher catch.
So one of the most exciting projects that I'm working on right now is with the South Atlantic Fisheries Management Council. And it's kind of getting late at night here, and we're all going to wear out pretty soon, so I'm not going to get into a big, long discussion about fisheries management in North America. But I will tell you that it's the fisheries councils that set the restrictions. They decide what the catches are going to be, where the spawning grounds are, where the boundaries where there's no fish zones are going to be. And those councils are made up of recreational fishermen and commercial fishermen and scientists from NOAA and from the States. And they don't always see eye to eye. You couldn't put it any better. The scientists say there's no fish left, and the fishermen say, I've seen them all over the place. So this last year, the South Atlantic Fisheries Management Council asked me and Jennifer Shirk, whose name came up a few times, to lead them through the process of beginning to start a citizen science program in the South Atlantic, which we're talking about North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Not the Gulf Coast of Florida, but the Atlantic coast of Florida. And they brought together 75 commercial and recreational fishermen. And we worked with them for 2 days. And I started with a talk not all that different from what you heard here tonight. We call it the elephant talk because of the elephant in the fourth slide, right? And when we started it, this is what my audience looked like, all 75 of them. 2 days later, when we were done, we got a standing ovation. Mm-hmm. And they said, we're going to do this with you, we have to do this. And they said, what's happened here is you've shown us that you're willing to listen. And the way that we did that was we started the whole workshop with 4 hours of listening. We just said, tell us the issues, tell us where the scientists are wrong, tell us what the problems are, and tell us as fishermen what you know and what you can help us understand and manage. And nobody had ever listened to them before. That was like the most important thing that we could have done. And then in the second day, we started saying, okay, but wait a minute. You saw this there and you saw this there, but what about in between here? Let's talk about random sampling. Let's talk about stratified sampling. And so we actually worked with them on the course of the day to begin to understand the science between trying to figure out where the fish were. And because we had developed a rapport with them and listened to them, they found us trustworthy, and we actually were able to get started on something. And the other thing that a lot of them said was, you know what, if we don't work with NOAA and with the states and with the fisheries biologists, our kids are not going to have anything to fish for in a lot of places. We know that. We can see that. So I agree with you. It's one of the very biggest challenges. In a nutshell, what it is it's citizen science where the data that are being collected can be used against the person who's collecting the information. Yeah, so. Right. Right. So, but we're working on it. Maybe I'll come back someday and talk about fisheries management here. We never know. The question?
That's the question.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Rick, for your talk. You mentioned a couple of themes for when citizen science is really successful. So turning a hobby into citizen science, but doing the opposite is more of a challenge. And then also it seems that some of the examples you showed that are successful are also when it's related specifically to human health, whether it's with the pig farms
Right.
or air quality. I'm just wondering if there's some other sort of common threads for when citizen science can be really successful and in instances where it's just not a good match for a science question.
Well, I think times when citizen science can be most successful are when it does directly, or people are only interested in what they're interested in. I mean, that's just, and people learn the most when they're learning about something that they really care about or that's going to impact them. You know, we tried to reach out to get new audiences involved in science and in citizen science for 20, 25 years with funds from the National Science Foundation. And you try pizza lunches, and you try badging systems and competitions and games, and wouldn't this be fun, and get your kids involved. I mean, you try everything, right? In New York, where I'm from, where Cornell is, we've got a real issue there with fracking, with hydraulic fracturing. And people there are really concerned about, fracking has been temporarily at least banned in New York, but people are still worried about the potential impacts from hydraulic fracturing on water quality. And so when we had an informational meeting in our little town and said, we're going to start a water quality monitoring program, would you like to come and learn how to monitor your streams, your rivers around your farms in this community? We had people we never would have dreamt of that came out of the woodwork and came to that meeting. I mean, you know, if you wanted to make like a stereotype, almost caricature of a farmer living in rural New York who just is usually with his cows, you know, and doesn't come out very much, they came out because this was going to have an impact on them. I honestly, truthfully, haven't really followed what happened with that program. I tried to help it get started. I didn't really go back. I don't know how many of them stayed involved and stayed in the monitoring, but, you know, we're talking here about the projects being most successful when they're really going to hurt people or help people, or like with the fishermen. Times when they're probably not going to work, segmented worms. I just don't think you're going to get people interested. I mean, somebody really tried that. That's not a joke. And so, I mean, there is a Great Lakes Worm Watch that was successful for a while. I don't know if it's still going on at this point. But I think just, like I said before, there's so much data to be collected by people who are already out collecting data, just to try to start there, get all of their information into databases and get them ambassadors for science and citizen science. I wouldn't really try with those other projects right now. So.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much, Rick. I just want to mention, so everybody have a good night, but I want to mention for those that are staying here on campus with the, for the science symposium tomorrow, the breakfast is at 7 o'clock. And the science symposium, the doors here will open at 7:30, and the symposium will start at 9, okay, for those that are staying. But thanks everybody for coming out, really appreciate it. And